He didn't slam a stack of cash on a sticky table. He slid a single, impossibly heavy card of polished black metal across the starched linen of the tablecloth. The card, an exclusive, invitation-only credit instrument known as the Centurion, made a soft, menacing hiss as it came to a stop beside a bread plate. $10,000. That was the wager. He looked the young woman, barely out of her teens, straight in her tired, grey eyes, and uttered the words that would curdle the very atmosphere of the 3 Michelin-star restaurant. "I'll wager $10,000 right now that you can't tell me what's wrong with this in under 5 minutes. He thought he was purchasing a moment of exquisite humiliation, a brief, cruel spectacle to vent the frustrations of a disastrous day. He thought he was putting a nobody, a girl in a sommelier's apron, in her place. But he didn't know the woman refilling his water glass was not just a sommelier in training. She was a ghost from a world he desperately sought to conquer, a world of line, form, and impossible grace. And she was about to deconstruct his life's ambition on the back of a cocktail napkin. The silence that would follow her verdict would be more devastating than any explosion. The air inside Ethelgard, New York's most notoriously exclusive restaurant, was a carefully curated symphony of hushed tones, the gentle clink of crystal silver, and the distant, almost subliminal sizzle from a kitchen run with military precision. For Ilara Vance, the air tasted of exhaustion, starched linen, and the bitter tang of deferred dreams. At 22, Ilara wore the black apron of an apprentice sommelier over a crisp white shirt and tailored trousers. The uniform was a shield, a costume of professional invisibility. To the patrons, the titans of finance, the doyens of old society, the art world luminaries, she was a pair of hands, hands that expertly uncorked a 1982 Petrus, that refilled water glasses without a single drip, that moved with an unnatural, silent efficiency. They never saw the shadows under her eyes, the faint tremor of fatigue in her fingers after her 10th hour on her feet. They certainly didn't see the mind behind the placid mask. They didn't know that as she described the terroir of a Sancerre, she was mentally calculating the load-bearing capacity of the restaurant's century-old ceiling beams. They didn't know that while polishing wine glasses until they were as clear as air, she was sketching phantom blueprints in her mind, solving structural problems for buildings that would never be built. She was a ghost in her own life. A top student at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, the recipient of the coveted Kress Fellowship for European Study, she had been on a trajectory aimed at the stars. Then, 2 years ago, the universe had tilted on its axis. Her mother's diagnosis, a rare, aggressive form of multiple sclerosis, had shattered everything. The fellowship money was diverted to experimental treatments. The promising internships were abandoned for jobs that paid in cash now. The world of blueprints and steel gave way to a world of tips and tired feet. Ethelgard, with its generous, by industry standards, pay and access to wealthy clientele, was the pinnacle of her fall from grace. A low, guttural sound of frustration from the corner booth, Table 1, the king's seat, snapped her back to the present. The table was occupied by Alistair Finch and his coterie of anxious-looking men in $1,000 suits. Finch. Ilara knew the name, of course. Everyone in New York who cared about the shape of the city knew his name. He was a real estate demigod, a man who didn't just build skyscrapers but erected monuments to his own ego. His firm, Finch Holdings, was known for buying historical landmarks and gutting them to build gleaming, sterile towers of glass and steel. He was old money, but he wielded it with the brutal force of a new money tyrant. Tonight, Finch was in a foul mood. His face, usually a mask of patrician indifference, was flushed with anger. Spread across the table were not plates of food, but rolled-up architectural drawings and spreadsheets. "It's a catastrophe, Marcus," Finch snarled, his voice a low growl that carried across the hushed dining room. "An unmitigated multi-billion-dollar catastrophe. The engineers are telling me it can't be done." Marcus Thorne, Finch's lead architect, and a man who looked perpetually apologetic, winced. "Sir, the physics are immutable. The cantilever for the grand ballroom on the 90th floor, the celestial plaza, the sheer weight of it, combined with the wind shear at that altitude. The core structure as designed won't support it. We're seeing stress fractures in the simulations that are catastrophic. I don't pay you for physics, Marcus. I pay you for vision." Finch slammed his fist on the table, a muted thud that made the water glasses tremble. Elara, standing a few feet away at a service station, instinctively reached out to steady a decanter. "My father built the foundations of this city with steel and guts. He never let physics get in the way of a legacy. This tower is my legacy. That ballroom, hanging over the city like a diamond in the sky, is the entire point. Find a way." "We've tried everything," another architect chimed in, his voice thin with fear. "Buttressing, tuned mass dampers, exotic composites. The design itself is fundamentally unsound." "Unsound?" Finch's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You're telling me I've sunk $2 billion into a foundation for an unsound design you yourselves drafted?" He laughed, a short, ugly bark devoid of humor. "It's tragic, really. This is what happens when you have men with degrees but no imagination, no feel for the materials. They're just technicians, biological calculators." He gestured vaguely, his hand sweeping in a dismissive arc that happened to end pointing directly at Elara. They might as well be pouring wine. Elara froze. The insult was casual, impersonal, and yet it landed like a physical blow. It was the summary dismissal of her entire world, the one she had lost, and the one she now inhabited. She felt a familiar, hot coil of anger tighten in her stomach. She turned to retreat to the sanctuary of the wine cellar, to lose herself in the cool, silent dark. "You!" Finch's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Girl, more water." Elara's jaw tightened. She picked up the heavy crystal pitcher, her movements deliberate and controlled. She approached the table, her face a perfect mask of professional deference. As she leaned in to pour, her eyes fell upon the drawing unfurled in the center of the table. It wasn't a formal blueprint, but a napkin sketch, a frantic, angry doodle Finch must have made. It showed a cross-section of the tower's core, the absurdly ambitious, cantilevered ballroom jutting out into empty space. She saw it in a single, gut-wrenching instant. It wasn't just unsound. It was a masterpiece of architectural vanity, a design so fundamentally flawed, so arrogant in its defiance of gravity, that it was almost beautiful in its wrongness. The problem wasn't the materials or the buttressing. The problem was the fulcrum point. The entire load was being distributed downwards onto a single shear wall that was never designed to handle that kind of torsional stress. They weren't just building a skyscraper. They were building the world's most expensive tuning fork, and the wind was going to play it until it snapped. A small, involuntary sound escaped her lips. Not a word, just a faint intake of breath, a sound of horrified recognition. Finch, who had been watching her with predatory stillness, pounced. "Did you have something to add, sweetheart? Does the structural integrity of a super-tall skyscraper fall within the purview of your wine-pairing duties?" His men snickered, a chorus of nervous, sycophantic laughter. Elara straightened up slowly, placing the water pitcher on the table with a soft, definitive click. The silence in the dining room deepened. The couple at the next table paused their conversation, forks hovering mid-air. The maître d' began to drift over, sensing a disturbance in the carefully balanced ecosystem of the restaurant. "The purview of my duties, Mr. Finch," Ilara said, her voice quiet but carrying the resonant clarity of a bell, "is to ensure that everything is in its right place and properly supported. Whether it's a bottle of wine or a 90-story building, the principles of balance and foundation are the same." The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus Thorne's jaw hung slightly agape. Finch stared at her, his eyes narrowing. The casual amusement in his expression was gone, replaced by a flicker of disbelief, then a surge of pure, undiluted rage. He was not a man who suffered correction, especially not from a servant. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You're trying to solve the problem at the extremity," Ilara continued, unable to stop herself. The architect within her, so long dormant, was clawing its way to the surface. "You're focusing on the cantilever. But the cantilever isn't the problem, it's the symptom. Your core design is creating a massive, unstable lever. You're transferring the entire dynamic load onto a single plane of shear walls. You need to redistribute the torsional load, probably by trisecting the core and implementing a bundled tube system tied together with sky bridges at the upper levels. You're trying to build a tree, Mr. Finch, but you've given it the root system of a flower." She had said too much. She knew it the moment the words were out. She had broken the cardinal rule of service. She had become visible. Finch's face was a thundercloud of fury. He felt the eyes of the other patrons on him. He, Alistair Finch, was being lectured on architectural theory by a waitress. The humiliation was a physical, burning sensation. "Stop," he commanded. He stood up, using his height to loom over her. He was a bull of a man, accustomed to dominating any space he occupied. He reached into his jacket and pulled out not a wallet, but the sleek black Centurion card. He held it between two fingers. "You think you're clever," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You picked up some jargon from a textbook, maybe an architecture class you flunked out of, before realizing your true calling was fetching things for your betters." "I should get back to my station," Ilara said, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel her job, her precious, necessary job, evaporating around her. "No," Finch said, stepping in her path. "You wanted to play architect. Let's play." He slid the card onto the table. "You see this sketch?" He pointed a thick finger at the napkin. "My architects, men from MIT and Yale, say it's impossible. A fatal flaw." He leaned in, his cologne, a scent of sandalwood and arrogance, washing over her. "I'll wager $10,000 right now that you can't tell me what's wrong with this in under 5 minutes. Not just your pseudo-intellectual babble about roots and flowers, but a viable, structural solution. A solution that saves my ballroom." The entire restaurant was now watching. It was a gladiatorial contest, and she was the sacrifice. "And if I fail?" Ilara asked, her voice a reedy whisper. Finch smiled, a chilling, predatory expression. "If you fail, you will stand in the center of this dining room and apologize to me and my team for your presumption. You will admit you are a fraud. And then," he glanced at the horrified maître d', "you will be fired. On the spot. I will personally see to it." The maître d', a man named Julian, who had always been kind to her, gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Don't do it. Just walk away." But Ilara looked at the napkin. She looked at the impossible, beautiful, fatally flawed design. And then she thought of the letter in her locker, the final notice from the experimental treatment center, the one that said her mother's next round of infusions, The only thing keeping her mobile would be her last, unless a payment of $9,600 was made within the week. $10,000. It was her mother walking for another 6 months. It was a reprieve from the terror that kept her awake at night. She looked at Alistair Finch, at the smug certainty on his face, the utter conviction that he could buy and sell the world and everyone in it. "You want a viable solution?" she asked, her voice finding a sudden, unexpected strength. "I want a miracle," Finch sneered. "Fine," Ilara said. She picked up a heavy silver fork from the table. "I don't need 5 minutes. I need 1. The room held its breath. Alistair Finch sat back down, a look of triumphant cruelty on his face. He was about to get his show. He gestured to the napkin. "The floor is yours, prodigy." Ilara ignored the title. She ignored the stares of the other diners. She ignored the frantic, pleading look from Julian. The sounds of the restaurant faded into a dull roar, the same way they used to in the studio at Columbia during a late-night design charrette. The world narrowed to the small, stained square of paper and the impossible problem it represented. She wasn't Ilara Vance, the apprentice sommelier, anymore. She was Ilara Vance, the architect. "Your mistake," she began, her voice steady and clear, "is one of ego, not engineering. You see the ballroom as an addition, a jewel you're hanging on the outside of the building." She took the silver fork and, using its tines, began to draw in the linen tablecloth, pressing hard to leave indented lines. The patrons gasped at the desecration of the expensive fabric, but Finch waved a hand for them to be silent, his eyes glued to her movements. "You can't hang it," she said, her hands moving with a speed and certainty that was mesmerizing. "You have to weave it in. It can't be an appendage. It must be the heart." "Metaphors," Finch grunted. "I'm paying for solutions." "I'm getting there," she snapped back, the sudden authority in her voice startling even herself. "Your bundled tube concept is a good start, but you're thinking of it as 3 separate pillars. That's wrong. You need to treat them as a single, braided entity." She drew 3 parallel lines with the fork, then began to cross-hatch them with diagonal braces. A diagrid exoskeleton, but not on the outside. You weave it through the core. The tubes don't just stand next to each other. They lean on each other. They transfer the load diagonally across the structure. Marcus Thorne leaned forward, his eyes wide. A braided core. The sheer stresses would be immense. "Exactly," Ilara said, not looking up. "Which is why you turned the problem into the solution." She moved her fork to the drawing of the cantilevered ballroom. "This room, you see it as dead weight. A parasite, it's not. It's your anchor, your counterweight." With a swift, brutal motion, she used the fork to score a line straight through the middle of Finch's beloved ballroom on the napkin. A collective gasp went through Finch's team. "You can't have a single massive open space," she declared. "It's a structural impossibility and an acoustic nightmare. You split it. You run a massive, hollow structural section, a spine, right through the center of the room, connecting it directly to the braided core. This spine becomes the primary load-bearing element. The ballroom isn't hanging off the building anymore. The building is hanging off the ballroom's spine, which is integrated into the core itself." She looked up, her grey eyes burning with an intensity that made Finch recoil slightly. "You don't fight the wind shear. You use it. The spine acts like the keel of a sailboat. It allows the top of the building to sway, to flex, dissipating the energy instead of resisting it. The ballroom becomes the single most important structural element in the top third of the tower. It's not the jewel, it's the linchpin." She dropped the fork. It clattered onto a plate with a sharp, final sound that echoed in the profound silence. She had taken Finch's vanity project, his diamond in the sky, and turned it into a workhorse. She hadn't just solved the problem, she had redefined it. She had taken his flawed, arrogant vision and made it stronger, safer, and more elegant than his own high-paid architects ever could. The minute was up. Elara stood straight, her hands clasped behind her back, her breathing shallow. She had laid her soul bare on a restaurant table. Now she waited for the verdict. The silence that descended upon Table 1 was not merely an absence of noise. It was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket. The air, once filled with the confident baritone of Alistair Finch, was now a vacuum. Marcus Thorne stared at the napkin, then at the indentations on the linen tablecloth, his face a mask of dawning, horrified awe. He looked as if he had just seen a street magician correctly guess his PIN code, and then explain the unified theory of everything. Alistair Finch's face was a stony tableau. The confident smirk, the cruel amusement, had been wiped away, leaving behind a stark, raw confusion. He traced the line she had scored through his ballroom design with a trembling finger. A spine, a keel, the building hanging off the ballroom. It was audacious. It was sacrilegious. And he knew, with the sickening certainty of a man who had built 100 structures, that it was brilliant. It was the kind of thinking his father had possessed, a brutal, elegant simplicity that saw the true nature of a problem. "Marcus," Finch said, his voice a dry rasp. "Run the simulation in your head. Now." Marcus Thorne blinked, sweat beading on his upper lip. He closed his eyes. The other architects at the table were doing the same, their faces contorted in concentration as they tried to build Elara's vision in their minds. The seconds ticked by, each one a hammer blow in the silent room. Finally, Marcus opened his eyes. He looked at Finch, and his expression was one of pure, unadulterated shock. "It works," he whispered. The words were barely audible, but they landed like cannon fire. "My God, sir! It works! The torsional load is distributed. The spine acts as a primary and secondary damper. It actually makes the structure stronger." He looked at Elara, his professional jealousy warring with a profound, humbling respect. It's revolutionary." "Shut up, Marcus," Finch hissed, but the command had no heat. It was the automatic defense of a king who had just been checkmated by a pawn. Finch slowly raised his eyes from the napkin to look at Elara. For the first time, he truly saw her. He saw past the apron, past the tired posture. He saw the fierce, blazing intelligence in her grey eyes. He saw the mind of a master builder trapped behind the face of a girl. "Who are you?" he asked. The question was not an insult this time. It was a genuine, desperate plea for information. Apprentices sommelier do not redesign super-tall skyscrapers between water service intervals. They do not speak of braided cores and dynamic loads. So I ask you again. Who are you? Elara didn't answer right away. She picked up the water pitcher and, with a steady hand, refilled his glass, the simple act of service now a profound assertion of power. "I'm just a girl with no imagination," she said, her voice soft, throwing his own words back at him. "Remember? A biological calculator." "Don't play games with me," Finch snapped, his composure cracking. "That solution, the way you integrated the primary function with the structural support, that's not something you read in a book. That's deep design theory. That's the kind of thing they taught at the Academy in Rome." The name hung in the air. The American Academy in Rome. The most prestigious institution for architecture and the arts in the world, a place reserved for geniuses. Marcus Thorne's eyes widened further. He fumbled for his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen with a frantic energy. He wasn't searching Google. He was accessing private university alumni databases, scholarship archives. No, Marcus breathed, staring at his phone. It can't be. He looked from the screen to Ilara, then back again. Alistair, look. He practically threw the phone onto the table in front of Finch. On the screen was a photograph from an architectural journal, dated 3 years prior. It showed a much younger Ilara, her face bright with optimism and untainted by fatigue, standing on a Roman balcony. She was holding a large, ornate scroll. The caption beneath read, "Ilara Vance accepts the prestigious Prix de Rome, the youngest recipient in 50 years, for her groundbreaking thesis, The Symbiotic Structure, Integrating Aesthetics and Engineering in Hypertowers." Finch stared at the photograph. He looked at the hopeful young woman on the screen, then at the weary, defiant woman standing before him. The bones were the same. The eyes, those startlingly intelligent grey eyes, were identical. "Vance," Finch whispered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "Professor Eldridge's protégé at Columbia, the one who vanished." Ilara flinched, as if the name itself were a physical shock. She hadn't been that person in a long, long time. To the world of academia, Ilara Vance was a tragic mystery, a prodigy who had simply disappeared off the face of the earth at the moment of her greatest triumph. "I haven't used that name in years," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My God," Finch said, sinking back into the booth. The plush leather groaned under his weight. My team, we studied your thesis. The core principles of it are what we based the initial tower design on. We tried to copy your ideas." He let out a hollow laugh, and we failed. We had the sheet music, but we didn't have the musician. He gestured around the opulent dining room, at the gilded ceilings and the wealthy patrons. "But why? You had the world at your feet. Why are you here, serving overpriced wine to men like me?" Ilara's gaze drifted to the black credit card still sitting on the table. The $10,000. "Because architectural theory doesn't pay for neuroimmunologists," she said, her voice flat and devoid of self-pity. "And a Prix de Rome can't cover a single dose of Tisabri." The confession hung in the air, sharp and painful, stripping away the last vestiges of Finch's arrogance. The story came out then, not in a torrent, but in a quiet, measured recitation of facts. The diagnosis, the collapsing finances, the crushing, relentless weight of a healthcare system that would bankrupt a millionaire, let alone a graduate student. "I didn't lose my ambition, Mr. Finch," she concluded, her eyes finding his. "I just had to aim it at something more important than a skyline. Keeping my mother out of a wheelchair requires more creative problem-solving and ruthless budgeting than any skyscraper you could ever conceive of." Finch sat in stunned silence. He looked at his team, men who complained about the thread count of their hotel sheets. He looked at himself, a man who measured his worth in feet and inches of steel and glass. He had been so obsessed with building a legacy of stone that he had forgotten that real legacies were built of sacrifice and love. In that moment, he felt profoundly, shamefully small. He looked at the napkin, at the elegant, brutal solution she had sketched in an instant. A solution that had just saved him from a $2 billion public humiliation and likely added $1 billion more to the final value of his tower. "You just gave me $1 billion consultation," Finch said quietly. "For free." "Consider it part of the water service," Ilara replied, her professional mask slipping back into place. "Now, the wager. You lost." Finch looked at the Centurion card. He picked it up. He didn't just slide it toward her. He stood up, a gesture of respect he hadn't offered anyone in years. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. "You're right," Finch said, his voice heavy with a humility he had never known. "I lost." He held out the card. "The wager was for $10,000. Take the card. Go to any ATM. The pin is 1958, my father's birth year." Elara looked at the card, then at his face. She saw the shock, the respect, but she also saw the mind of an opportunist already recalibrating. He wasn't just paying a debt, he was making an investment. She took the card. Her fingers, calloused from work, brushed against his. The cool, heavy metal felt like a key in her hand, a key to her mother's health, a key out of this life. "Thank you," she said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a cellar to inventory." She turned to walk away, the victory a cold, hard knot in her stomach. "Wait!" Finch called out, his voice urgent, desperate. "Don't go." Alistair Finch didn't just call out. He moved. With an agility that belied his bulk, he rounded the edge of the table, his movements clumsy with unpracticed urgency. The titan of industry, a man whose time was billed in $5,000 increments, was scrambling to stop a waitress from leaving his sight. He blocked her path to the wine cellar, his large frame an impassable wall. But for the first time that night, his posture wasn't about intimidation. It was about supplication. He looked like a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. "Elara. Miss Vance," he corrected himself, the name feeling foreign and important on his tongue. "Please, we need to talk. A real conversation." "I have a job to do, Mr. Finch," Elara said, her voice cool. She clutched the Centurion card in her palm, its weight a grounding reality. She had what she needed. The transaction was over. "Forget your job," Finch said, his voice a low, intense rumble. "I'll buy this entire restaurant and shut it down tonight if it gets me 10 more minutes of your time. I want you to come and work for me." The proposal dropped into the silent dining room, like a stone into a still pond. The ripples of shock were visible on every face. Marcus Thorne looked like he might faint. Julian, the maître d'état, stood frozen by the reservation desk. "I'm not looking for a new position," Elara said, though her heart began a frantic, traitorous rhythm against her ribs. "I'm not offering you a position," Finch countered, his eyes boring into hers. "I'm not talking about a junior architect role in some forgotten corner of the firm. I'm offering you the key to the kingdom. I want you to head the Finch Tower project, not as an employee, as a partner." He saw the flicker of disbelief in her eyes, and he pressed his advantage, reverting to the only language he truly trusted, the overwhelming, brute force logic of money. "Name your price," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur that was somehow more commanding than a shout. "A signing bonus. 7 figures. Is that enough to start the conversation? Your mother's medical care? Consider it a non-issue. Not just the next treatment, but all of it. For the rest of her life. The best doctors, the best facilities, anywhere in the world. We will have her moved to a private suite at Johns Hopkins by the end of the week. A dedicated team. No more waiting lists, no more insurance forms, no more fear. All you have to do is say yes." The words were not just an offer. They were a meticulously crafted weapon, each syllable designed to dismantle her defenses. He spoke of Johns Hopkins and 7 figures the way a general speaks of artillery and air support. He was laying siege to her heart, and she could feel the walls of her resolve beginning to crumble into dust. The temptation was not an abstract concept. It was a physical sensation, a dizzying, nauseating wave of hope that threatened to pull her under. She could almost feel the phantom weight of the last 2 years, a crushing burden of fear, exhaustion, and silent desperation, begin to lift from her shoulders. In her mind's eye, a series of images flashed with agonizing clarity. The sterile white of the clinic waiting room, the strained, brave smile on her mother's face after a painful infusion, the stack of red-lettered envelopes on their tiny kitchen table, the cold dread that seized her every night as she tried to sleep, the terror that this month, this week, would be the one where she finally failed, where the money ran out and the disease won. Finch was offering her an end to the war. Not just a truce, but total, unconditional victory. All she had to do was surrender herself. Across the room, Julian, the maitre d', caught her eye. He had seen her struggles, had quietly slipped her extra shifts and staff meals when he knew money was tight. Now he gave her a frantic, almost desperate nod, his eyes wide with vicarious hope. "Take it. For the love of God, child, take it," his expression screamed. "This is your miracle." Finch saw her waver. He saw the conflict warring in her grey eyes, the slight tremble in her lower lip. A slow, deeply satisfied smile, the smile of a hunter who knows the chase is over, spread across his face. He had found her price. It was higher than he'd expected, but that only made the acquisition more thrilling. "We'll send a car for you in the morning," he said, his voice shifting back to its default setting of command. The negotiation phase now concluded in his mind. 9 a.m. sharp. We'll have the preliminary contracts ready for your review. You'll need a new wardrobe, of course. We have an image to maintain at the firm. We have an image to maintain. The phrase, so casually, so thoughtlessly uttered, was not a bucket of ice water. It was a structural engineer's diagnostic hammer, striking a single precise blow against the facade of his offer and revealing the catastrophic flaw within. The dizzying hope did not recede. It shattered, leaving behind a silence as profound and terrifying as the one that had followed her solution on the napkin. In that crystalline silence, she saw everything with a horrifying new clarity. She looked at Alistair Finch's triumphant face and saw him not as a savior, but as a collector. He was a man who hung masterpieces on his walls not because he loved art, but because he loved owning them. He had just discovered a rare, uncatalogued Da Vinci sketch in a flea market, and now he was preparing to mount it in a ridiculously ornate frame to hang in his gallery. He wasn't hiring a partner. He was acquiring an asset. He didn't see Alara Vance, the daughter who had sacrificed her dreams to care for her mother. He didn't see the woman who had endured 2 years of quiet humiliation and bone-deep fatigue. He saw the ghost of a prodigy, a brilliant mind he could plug into his broken machine to make it work. He had derided her, humiliated her in front of an entire room of his peers, and was now attempting to purchase her absolution, assuming her dignity, like everything else in his world, was a commodity with a negotiable price. The Black Centurion card, still clutched in her hand, suddenly felt less like a key and more like the first, cold link in a very heavy, gilded chain. Her breathing, which had been shallow and ragged, became slow and deliberate. The architect within her took over, the part of her mind that saw not chaos, but systems, structures, and foundations. "The best medical care in the world?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. "The very best," Finch confirmed, beaming, mistaking her question for the beginning of a negotiation. "Money is no object. A 7-figure signing bonus? A baseline," he said magnanimously. "We can discuss specifics tomorrow." "And a full partnership in the Finch Tower project," she continued, her gaze locked on his, unblinking. As I said. He nodded, the smile fixed on his face. And all I have to do, she said, the words falling like perfectly placed stones, is build my entire future on the memory that less than an hour ago you looked at me and saw nothing more than a pair of hands to refill your water glass, that I must forget that you wagered my livelihood on a cruel bet you were certain I would lose? The smile didn't vanish from Finch's face. It froze, then cracked, like plaster on a wall under sudden stress. Now that's not. The circumstances were different. No, Elara said. The word was not loud. It was not angry. It was a quiet, perfectly engineered statement of fact, spoken with the finality of a blueprint being signed. It had the density of a singularity, sucking all the air, all the possibility, all of Finch's smug certainty out of the space between them. Finch stared at her. His mind, so adept at calculating risk and leverage, utterly failing to process this new data. What? Did you not hear me? I am offering you your life back. I am offering you the world on a silver platter. You're offering me a beautiful cage, she corrected him, her voice still quiet, but now infused with a sorrowful steel. A penthouse suite in a building with a fundamentally compromised foundation. You think because my circumstances are desperate, my principles must be cheap. You didn't see value in me when I was pouring your water, Mr. Finch. You only saw it when I could be of use to you. The person you want to hire is the architect, the prodigy from the photograph. But the person you'd be getting is the woman you insulted. The woman who knows, with absolute certainty, that you would have let her be fired and publicly shamed without a second thought if she hadn't been able to solve your puzzle. She took a single, deliberate step back, creating a physical space between them that mirrored the ideological chasm that had opened up. Our entire professional relationship would be built on that moment of profound ugliness, on that grotesque imbalance of power. I would never be your partner. I would always be the clever waitress you bought. Every success I had would be tainted by the knowledge of how it began. I would see your condescension in every compliment, your ownership in every paycheck, and eventually I would begin to see myself that way too. You are throwing away your future, Finch finally sputtered, his composure shattering completely. His face, which had been pale with shock, began to flush with a deep, apoplectic red. For what? For pride? For some misplaced, romantic notion of dignity? For the foundation? Elara said, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. You, of all people, should understand that. You can't fix a flawed foundation by building a more beautiful facade on top of it. It doesn't matter how perfect the design is, how strong the materials are. If the base is unsound, the entire structure is destined to fail. She held up the Centurion card, the black metal gleaming under the restaurant's soft lights. I will, however, accept the terms of our wager. $10,000. You lost, and this is the price. It will pay for my mother's next round of treatment. It will give me a month to breathe, a month to find a way forward, on my own terms, on solid ground. You'll be back here in a month, begging for this job, he roared, his voice echoing in the now silent dining room, his fury and disbelief warring for dominance. I don't think so, she said softly. She turned her gaze from him and looked at Marcus Thorne, who was watching her with an expression of stunned, reverential admiration. Then she looked back at Finch. You did something for me tonight, Mr. Finch. Something you never intended. You reminded me of who I am. You reminded me what I'm capable of. You reminded me what my work is worth. She paused, letting the weight of her next word settle. And it turns out It's a hell of a lot more than a 7-figure salary and a clear conscience for you." She turned away from him then, the finality of the gesture absolute. She did not walk to the wine cellar, nor did she retreat to the kitchens. She walked directly to the maitre d's station, her posture as straight and true as a plumb line. "Julian," she said, her voice soft but firm, placing the black card on the polished wood of the counter. "I'm sorry to do this mid-shift, but I quit." Before he could protest, she reached behind her back and untied the black apron, the symbol of her servitude and her survival for 2 long years. She folded it with a neat, architectural precision and placed it on the counter beside the card. A quiet, dignified severance. Without a backward glance, she walked past the gawking patrons, past the stunned architects, and pushed open the heavy oak doors of Ethelgard. The cool, damp air of the New York night washed over her face. It smelled of rain and exhaust fumes, of wet pavement and distant sirens. It smelled of freedom. It was a terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly clean scent. She didn't look back. Behind her, in the golden light of the restaurant, Alistair Finch stood alone amidst the wreckage of his certainty. He, the architect of a lonely empire, was just beginning to realize, with a dawning, sickening horror, that he had just encountered the one thing in the world his money could not buy, a structure with a flawless foundation. The first thing Alara did was walk 12 blocks in the light rain, letting the city's chill seep into her bones and wash away the overheated artificial atmosphere of the restaurant. She didn't hail a cab. She needed the ground under her feet. At a nondescript bank branch with a 24-hour ATM, she slid the impossibly heavy Centurion card into the slot. The machine accepted it without protest. The screen glowed, asking for a PIN. 1958, his father's birth year. The casual intimacy of the detail felt obscene. She punched in the numbers, requested a cash withdrawal, and typed in the maximum amount, $9,600. The machine whirred and clicked, spitting out a thick brick of $100 bills. She took the money and the receipt, her hand shaking slightly. The transaction was complete. An hour later, she was sitting in a 24-hour diner in Chelsea, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like bitter necessity. The brick of cash was a solid, comforting weight in her bag. She had ordered a coffee and a slice of apple pie. On a clean paper napkin, she began to sketch. She wasn't solving a problem for a billionaire. She was drawing a small, modular, accessible house for her mother. A house with wide doorways for a wheelchair that might one day be needed, with a garden window that caught the morning sun, with a support beam in the ceiling that was both structurally essential and aesthetically beautiful. The lines flowed from her pen with an ease and grace she hadn't felt in years. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. The $10,000 was a reprieve, not a solution. But as she drew, another feeling began to bloom alongside the fear. A fierce, quiet joy. She was not a ghost anymore. She was an architect. 4 weeks later, the rain had given way to the crisp, unforgiving light of a New York autumn. Inside the penthouse office of Finch Holdings, the mood was one of quiet, grinding desperation. The Finch Tower project was hemorrhaging money and credibility. Alistair Finch had driven Marcus Thorne and his team to the brink of collapse, forcing them to reverse engineer Alara's napkin sketch. But it was like trying to recreate a living creature from a fossilized bone. They had the shape of her idea, but not its soul, its intricate, symbiotic logic. Every new simulation revealed another layer of complexity they couldn't grasp, another point of failure. The elegant, braided core she had envisioned became a clumsy, over-engineered tangle in their hands. Finch had become obsessed. He had spent a small fortune on private investigators, but Ilara Vance had vanished as completely as she had from the academic world years before. She had paid her mother's medical bills for the next 6 months in a single cash payment, then disappeared. No new address, no new job on the record. He found himself staring out his window for hours, looking at the skyline she should have been conquering, her name a constant, bitter refrain in his mind. His intercom buzzed, the sound sharp and intrusive. "Sir," his assistant's timid voice announced, "there's a courier here with a package for you. It's marked personal and confidential." "I'm not expecting anything," Finch growled. "Sir, the return address is Atelier Morgan." The name hit Finch like a physical blow. Atelier Morgan was a small, fiercely independent architectural firm run by the legendary Helena Morgan, a purist known for her uncompromising integrity and her eye for raw talent. They were the David to his Goliath, frequently nipping at his heels for the city's most prestigious cultural projects. "Send it in." A moment later, a simple, sturdy architect's tube was placed on his massive mahogany desk. His hands trembled slightly as he uncapped it. Inside, there was no letter, just a single, tightly rolled set of blueprints. He unfurled them. The paper was heavy, the ink a deep, precise black. It was her design. Not a sketch, not a concept, but a fully realized, breathtakingly elegant set of preliminary drawings for the Finch Tower's core and superstructure. Every line was perfect, every calculation precise. She had included detailed, handwritten notes in the margins, explaining the complex interplay of tensional and compressive forces, the rationale behind her material choices, the way the structure was designed to breathe with the wind rather than fight it. It was more than a solution. It was a poem written in the language of steel and glass. It was a gift worth billions. Tucked into the corner of the first page was a small, sealed envelope addressed to him. He tore it open. Inside was not a letter of explanation or a demand for payment. It was a cashier's check, payable to Alistair Finch. Amount $400. Memo: reimbursement. He stared at the check, utterly bewildered. $400? Then he saw the small, itemized receipt attached to it with a paperclip. It was from the clinic, a co-payment for 1 round of Tisabri infusion. The amount on the clinic's bill was $9,600. He finally understood. She had used his money exactly as she'd said she would, to pay for the treatment. And now she was sending back the change. She had taken his wager, used it for its intended purpose, and was now closing the account down to the last dollar. It was not a transaction. It was a final, devastating statement of principle. The slate was wiped clean. He owed her everything, and she owed him nothing. His desk phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the quiet awe of the room. It was Marcus. "Sir," Marcus said, his voice strained with an excitement Finch hadn't heard in years. "You need to see this. The Morgan press conference. It's live." Finch grabbed the remote and switched on the large screen on his wall. The camera showed Helena Morgan, her silver hair cut in a sharp, modern bob, standing at a podium. The backdrop was the construction site for the new Guggenheim Memorial Wing, a project Finch Holdings had lost in a stunning upset 2 weeks earlier. Atelier Morgan has always believed that a building is more than just a structure. It is a statement of values, Helena was saying, her voice resonant with authority. That is why we are so incredibly proud to announce the lead designer for this historic project. She turned and gestured to the woman standing beside her. It was Ilara. She was dressed not in a power suit, but in practical, well-tailored work clothes. She held a roll of blueprints under one arm. The shadows under her eyes were gone. The weariness in her posture had been replaced by a calm, focused fire. She looked solid, real. "Please welcome Ilara Vance," Helena said, her voice filled with genuine pride. A visionary talent whose approach to symbiotic structure is set to redefine the next generation of architecture. We didn't find Ms. Vance. She found us. She walked into our office a month ago with a portfolio that was, to put it mildly, the most brilliant work I have seen in my career. She asked not for a salary, but for a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared vision. We were only too happy to oblige. Finch sank into his chair, the blueprints spread before him like a ghost's legacy. He had tried to buy the artist, and she had refused. So he had been left with the art, a masterpiece he didn't deserve and could never have created, while his greatest competitor had gotten the artist herself. She hadn't come begging. She had used the month he'd paid for to find a place where she would be a partner, not a purchase, a place where her foundation would be sound. He looked down at the $400 check, a flimsy piece of paper that represented the most profound and costly loss of his entire life. He didn't tear it up. He didn't deposit it. He had it framed, along with the clinic receipt. It hung on his office wall for the rest of his life, not in a place of honor, but directly in his line of sight from his desk. It was a constant, humbling reminder of the waitress who had rebuilt his tower and deconstructed his world, proving that true worth could never be wagered, true strength could never be bought, and the most valuable things in the world are the ones that refuse to have a price tag.